to give you an insight as to what happened to some of our great African-American neighborhoods here in the United States, dating as far back as 1898. So come take a walk with me. One of the most fascinating enigmas that we typically witness when we look at American history often is how come when we speak of African-American neighborhoods in general, they typically refer to ghetto, places of low income, when in fact, when we look at history, this is absolutely not the case. The fact of the matter is, when African Americans would try to band together and create neighborhoods on their own, many times they were targeted by groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and even raided upon, burned down, a lot of its members being killed in mass amounts, as many as 300 at a time. You look at places like Black Wall Street, which was a predominantly Black neighborhood, doing well. It was thriving. It had doctor's offices, dental offices, restaurants, etc. And at the height of their endeavors, they were actually targeted by racists and subsequently burned to the ground. And this was back in the 1890s, so we could go as far as back as maybe about 30 years after Reconstruction. We could also look at a period in time inside of North Carolina, where a very similar thing happened. And using illegal government practices, they voted all of the Black congressmen out of the House of Representatives by using illegal measures to do so. They burnt down a printing press, which was a Black-owned printing press, and they pretty much, anybody that was prominent and African-American in that town, forced them out of the town by lynching, or they just burned their business to the ground. Ultimately, what you have here is a cover-up. You get a lot of times in history, whenever you have a predominantly Black society that's doing well, that's prospering, they'll go through many extents to make it a cover-up, to make it seem as if it were non-existent, because they didn't want this part of history to be well known to them. And especially among white nationalists. This is consistent throughout history when you look at Black history and when you look at prospering all-Black neighborhoods.
It was something that was hidden.
This entire historic community was obliterated.
The story here you will not find in most history books, and even 100 years later, today, the facts of what actually took place that day are still coming to light. We're traveling out to a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma. We get to meet firsthand with some of the residents there and see what they think about this cover-up in history known as the massacre of Black Wall Street. In 1921, there was a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma called the Greenwood District, a prominent community of Black-owned businesses. Tulsa locals refer to that period of Greenwood's history as a golden age.
If you can imagine just like an old-time downtown, things like movie theaters, pharmacies, hair salons, and so forth.
They called it Black Wall Street.
It was a mecca. It was a huge success.
But Black Wall Street's existence was very ironic because it flourished at a time when the KKK was incredibly powerful in Oklahoma, and the nation had just been through the race riots of 1919, called the Red Summer, when mobs of white people murdered dozens upon dozens of innocent Black people across the U.S.
There needed to be a sort of match or an igniter tossed on these embers. And that trigger event was an incident that involved two teenagers, Dick Rowland, 19-year-old Black boy who shined shoes downtown, Sarah Page, 17-year-old white girl who ran an elevator in a downtown building called the Drexel Building. He went to the building, boarded the elevator, something happened, Sarah Page began to scream. They both ran out of the elevator.
Even though we don't know exactly what happened in this elevator, we do know that a day later, Roland was arrested and taken to the courthouse. The local newspaper ran an article stating that Roland had assaulted Page, even though Page refused to press charges. The article basically was a call to action for whites.
A large white mob began to gather on the lawn of the courthouse. Dick Rowland was in jail on the top floor. A number of black men, several dozen, marched down to the courthouse to protect him, some of them armed. There was a struggle between one of the black men in the small group and one of the white men in the larger group, and things sort of went south from that point.
Hundreds of white people descended upon Black Wall Street armed. Black residents withdrew behind the railroad tracks that marked off the Greenwood district. Some of them were armed and fought back, but they were outnumbered by the white mob, which shot their way through. The white mob, they murdered, they looted, and they set fire to Black Wall Street.
This was the strategy, if you will, of how to deal with these communities, with these successful black communities. The effects were disastrous.
For 2 days, the Greenwood district burned. Martial law was declared and National Guard was brought in. By the time the massacre ended, Greenwood was in ruins. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed and a total of 35 blocks were burned. The total number of casualties is hard to pin down. Some initial reports stated that only white people died. Some others reported that between 30 and 100 black casualties with only 2 white casualties occurred. But estimates today put that number close to 300. As for those that survived, most of them lived in tent cities in the months that followed the massacre and were left to pick up the pieces on their own. After the massacre, a great cover-up started. Records went missing from city files, including the very article that started it all.
By calling it a riot, it's a way of trying to rewrite the history, assuming that there were both sides at fault, and that was not the case. I call it a massacre, and I call it that because that's what it was.
There's a part of this story that still haunts historians today. Nobody knows exactly where those 300 bodies were buried.
We got to find our people. We got to put them at rest. If not, we'll continue to be haunted by what was done so many years ago.
Kevin Ross, a local writer, is one of many in Tulsa descended from people who lost everything in the massacre.
The bullets were just raining down over us.
They set our house on fire and went right straight to the curtains and set the curtains on fire.
This is it. This is the area.
Using high-tech devices and high-tech radar, they were able to pinpoint 3 points of interest which depicted certain obstructions in the soil, which could only be an abundance of dead bodies.
Honestly, that's a lot of missing people that probably had families.
We owe it to the people whose blood has actually fertilized the grounds of this place.
There was a tremendous amount of racism.
Injustice plus time does not equal justice.
Today, a new mayor is reopening the investigation.
I think a pretty basic compact that a city makes with its citizens is, if somebody murders you, we will do everything we can to find out what happened to you and give your family closure. And whether you were murdered yesterday or you were murdered 98 years ago.
Today we're traveling to a place called Wilmington, North Carolina. We're going to meet some of the state officials there and some of the local residents. Race riot is a term that they use to cover up what actually took place down. So we'll meet firsthand with some of these government officials. For a long time, if you went to the library in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was one thing you weren't allowed to research.
We were refused. We were rejected by the librarian.
When I asked about or inquired about 1898, they wanted to know why.
I was told that, yes, they had something, but they kept it under lock and key.
The story of Wilmington and what happened here in 1898 still isn't widely known. This is a story of an American election, but also the story of a violent overthrow of a democratically elected government. In the late 1800s, Wilmington was the state's largest city. It had a majority black population, and historians today describe it as an anomaly in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, also black elected officials. For a time, this was true throughout the state. Take a look at the political poster of 1889 in North Carolina's House of Representatives. Here at the bottom, black representatives were from Wilmington, North Carolina. North Carolina also sent 4 black Republicans to Congress between 1875 and 1899. The Democratic and Republican Party of 1898 in many ways was occupied by opposite spectrums of the political attributes.
Most African Americans were voting for the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party was white voters almost exclusively. White supremacy was the central focus of the platform for the Democratic Party.
North Carolina farmers joined up with Republicans to form what they called the Fusion Party, and in 1894 they won the election. That meant that North Carolina now had a government that shared power between black and white politicians.
This was something that the Democratic Party folks were simply not going to accept.
A multiracial government wasn't only a disappointment for Democrats, it was more like a humiliation. Alfred Waddell came up with a plan to lure whites away from the Republicans by printing in newspapers and etc. that this was a white man's country and that white men must control and rule it. They would also run racist political cartoons.
Not everybody was literate in 1898, but to see a political cartoon of the type that ran, you may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
They also played on another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme. White men need to do all that they can to protect white womanhood.
A prominent Georgia writer named Rebecca Felton said,
"If it takes lynching a black man a day to protect white womanhood, I say lynch."
Her speech prompted a Wilmington black man named Alexander Manley, mostly of Creole descent, author of the black-run daily newspaper, to respond with a column stating a simple observation that at the time was shocking.
That white women who had liaisons with black men did so voluntarily and enthusiastically.
Manley wrote, "Many Negroes were sufficiently attractive for white girls to fall in love with them."
Manley pretty much said, in a nutshell, sometimes white women choose to be with black men.
The white response responded to it on a daily basis.
By the time the election rolls around on November 8th, black voters, Republican voters, had been thoroughly intimidated here.
The Democratic Party had a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts that would block black voters from going into their voting polls. Waddell made the statement in this election that Negro office holding should be brought to an end once and for all, even if it meant lining the river with their carcasses.
Democratic candidates won every seat they had a candidate up for election in.
And so they engineered what was essentially a coup d'etat.
The Democrats unveiled a document called the White Declaration of Independence. It contained an ultimatum. Cynthia Brown preserves a copy today.
We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin.
They would strip black men of their voting rights and would give white men a large portion of the employment of the city. And they demanded that Alex Manley leave the city within 24 hours or they would lynch him. The next morning, hundreds of white men marched to the offices of the Daily Record demanding Alex Manly's blood, but Manly had already fled to save his own life. They set his offices on fire, burning down the black printing press. This is where it once stood.
Once the white leadership destroyed Alex Manly's printing press, they destroyed one way in which the African American community in Wilmington could organize itself and keep itself informed. There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Wardell, who once threatened to fill the Cape Fear River with a bunch of black bodies, was now the new mayor of Wilmington. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled out into the streets, slaughtering black people left and right. The X's in these photos marks the spots where the first black residents were killed and the white mobs boasted about.
The stories are that they were dumped into the river, and there are varying stories about how many people were killed.
I see 40 to 60 clearly as fatalities as a result of the violence, but I think it was higher.
Many black people hid in the swamps and in the wooded areas surrounding the swamps, including Cynthia Brown's great-great-grandmother. Thousands of other residents fled Wilmington, never to return. Shortly afterwards, Democrats printed booklets boasting of a glorious victory. They even went on further, depicting black residents as the instigators.
Gross misrepresentation of what actually happened during 1898. You know, what you see is African American men with guns, not white men with machine guns.
Wilmington did a really great job of covering up a very dark past for a very long time.
Over the years, textbooks have struggled to accurately describe what happened in 1898 in North Carolina. They've gone as far as to blatantly describe what happened in a manner which depicts it as just something unfortunate that happened, and it was to fault of nobody. It was just one of those things. It's a legacy that North Carolina has yet to undo, and you still see its perpetrators on the names of schools, neighborhoods, streets, parks. One of the things that we could certainly do today is to let our young ones be aware of what happened in those times and not be subjected to what's written in the textbooks. It is our responsibility as adults and responsible Americans to let people in on what actually happened during these times. Most importantly, so that it's not written out of history. We don't want our children to be subjected to what's simply taught in schools and in textbooks as something very vague and unfortunate that happened. True that it was unfortunate, the fact of the matter being what happened was actually a cover-up, which is why the attitude of African Americans today is if you try to do well and progress, that there's no point. Better off just being an entertainer or an athlete, which we do not want to teach our children. We want to teach our children that it's good to go to school, to learn, to receive a doctorate degree, and to become a professional. And know that in the end, that you will succeed and that there are people behind you that will stand firmly, such as myself. Thank you.
Hell done froze the hell over. Okay. I'm woke. Okay, I'm woke like a rooster cock-a-doodle-doo.